Sorry? Yes, there's a little kitchen over there. I think we can just always take everything, and we have coffee and tea and everything. So I'll get it. Sorry, that is? Oh, no, but I know that other people know where to go, so maybe they're standing in front of the door again. Hello. Hello. No? Hey, I have to do that now, eh? You have to do it now. Okay. So it's already mounted. My mind. Yeah. Hello. You have to help. I can see it though. Yeah. Perfect. Hi. Yeah.
Hey, Detlef.
Can you hear me, Alina?
Yeah, there's a bit of background noise, but I guess when I'm talking, then you will hear me well,
lots of
right?
people coming in.
Okay, good.
I can hear you as well, but I don't know where. There?
Fine. So, this morning turned on.
No? Fine.
And audio volume here is a bit high. Maybe it's good to.
How about now?
So speakers.
How about now? Do you hear me okay now?
Yeah, we'll manage. Don't worry. I think you're now in the audio system of the room, I guess. Can you try again?
Okay, how about now?
No, that doesn't work yet. That doesn't work yet. Why not?
Okay. But yeah, since I only have to talk about.
All right. Why doesn't it work? HDMI. No picture. Audio volume.
Should be watching.
Get that one. Yeah.
How do you switch this thing on?
What is it?
This is the camera.
So it's not on.
Yeah.
Misschien hoe zit de master computer aan?
USB-C. Ja. Nee, dat lijkt mij niet.
Dat vind ik iets tussen laptop ook. Is belangrijk? Dan zie je ze al.
Okay. Ja, je kunt het lamp eruit doen.
Yes, yeah, like it was here. Somebody, I need somebody question. Yeah.
Like something that from the having we on that that's
It works, but now I have to share it.
This is not. Is this the proceedings? Is it? So one is the subject circle, the other is the.
Yes.
The song. So that's what we all said to you in the line.
Can you check on whether I'm sharing the right screen?
You are.
Okay, good. But if we get this system to work, the sound will be much better for Elena because now we're using the. Yeah. Also, this is a better microphone than the ones that we have in the printer, but let's solve that later.
Okay. Are we in a hurry or?
I think we are now 30 minutes late, right?
Yeah, and it depends on how much you need. And then put it on the note it works. Now. Yeah, but I did turn it off.
Jij begint, hè?
Okay. So, again, welcome everybody. We realized it yesterday, but now we're really here. Yes, so happy that we finally got started after half a year's work. Both Dennis and I are from the PDL. I think that probably doesn't need an introduction for most of you, but he's the program leader, basically PDL. So the model the global model we have at the PDL, but also he's a professor at visiting professor at Utrecht University. That's why we can use this very nice room as well. I think I'll leave most of the introduction to you then actually.
Okay.
If you have everything probably never. So enjoy this week. If you have any questions, anything I should know, please don't hesitate to address this. And yeah.
All right. Yeah. So welcome in Utrecht. I think there will be at some point the opportunity for everybody to introduce him and herself to everybody, right?
Yes, already. So we mostly do that. You can do this all week. Or it's during the poster presentations. And we'll explain that when we're there.
Yeah. Because I will be introducing myself first. I'm Detlef van Vuren. I'm a professor here at Utrecht University and also leading the image team. And I've been also doing quite a lot of integrated assessment work for IPCC. In my spare time, I also do other things like biking for climate. It was last Saturday. President. Yeah. Let me also introduce you to Utrecht. Utrecht was actually founded by the Romans. So the original name of the city was Ultrajectum, which means a place to cross the river Ul, which was the name of the River Rhine at the time, and that later became Utrecht. It was a place to cross things, and so here too we would like to cross disciplines and be working on things like justice and impacts. Yeah, the Romans actually left around 270. Then it became a Germanic city. One important thing for the city was that in halfway the Middle Ages, there was a Roman Catholic church built, cathedral. You can still see the tower. The rest of the cathedral was actually destroyed by a hurricane in 16 something. But one important thing was as well that in that cathedral, we first turned Protestant. We were Roman Catholic. We turned Protestant, and that also caused a war with Spain, the independence war of the Netherlands. And then the Netherlands had to define who they were because they were fighting the King of Spain, which was said to be the representative of God in the Netherlands. And so it was a bit awkward situation. So they had to define themselves. What are they? And they decided to define themselves based on justice. And so they said, we're a country of freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and that's why we have the right to liberate ourselves. And so actually it was one of the first constitutions of a country that defined freedoms, all these freedoms. So another reason maybe why Utrecht is a right place to be discussing justice issues. So we all know that climate change is happening, huh? And so now at the moment, temperature has been for some years above 1.5 degrees, the goal that we try to achieve in the Paris Agreement. And unfortunately, what we also know is that despite the fact that we have promised several times to start reducing greenhouse gas emissions have continued to increase. They continued to increase after Paris. They continued to increase also in recent years. The last few years, it might be that they are a little bit more stable, partly due to renewables, partly due to some climate policy. And so maybe we see a peak soon. But that's not long not enough because we have to go to zero. And so the question is, where are we heading? Are we going to continue on this pathway and have increasing impact, or do we manage to go to net zero, which is needed to stabilize temperature? So what we promised in the Paris Agreement, and do we do that soon enough to stay well below 2, or maybe we even go negative and maybe return to 1.5 degrees. And so, like I said, that's what we also promised in the Paris Agreement. And so we not only have to ask ourselves that for climate change, but because unfortunately there are many other environmental challenges in the world. This is a graph that you guys might recognize from Johan Rockström, which is the planetary boundaries. And he's emphasizing that in addition to climate change, we have ocean acidification, nitrogen, phosphorus problems, biodiversity problems, and they are somewhat related. And so we have to solve them together. Yeah, so if we ask ourselves, where are we heading? Then we need to know what will happen without new policies. We need to know what is needed to meet the goals. And basically, we're asking ourselves what will happen in the future. And that is not a very easy question to answer. And it basically means that we need to know something about population, about socioeconomic development, about technology, how that develops into the future, how fast will renewables reduce cost, what kind of political changes will happen. The elections in the US that changed quite a bit. How will demand for energy and food develop? How will environmental problems develop and how that will interact with our development? Yeah, and not only that, we also need to know that for different scales, if we have a bioenergy policy in Europe that might be produced in South America and therefore maybe have an interaction with deforestation. So we need to know this for different time periods. If we build a coal plant now, it's going to be staying there for another 20 years. A CO2 molecule that goes into the atmosphere will have an impact for centuries. And then we need to know how these things interact. Climate has an impact on biodiversity. Biodiversity as a sink for carbon has an impact on climate. And so we also have to couple that. And then all these things are uncertain as well. So at some point, it simply becomes a little bit too difficult to keep all of that in our heads. And so that's why computers can help us as an accounting system to go through these kinds of things. And this is why we think that integrated assessment models are a useful thing to use. Not because we think that we can predict the future. And so on the left side, I'm trying to indicate that we cannot predict the future, but that we somehow just explore pathways. And so the best analogy is not that with somebody predicting the future, but maybe with a map making. So what we do is to look at the future, to see which pathways are out there, to maybe think a little bit of, okay, if I follow this path, this is the things that I encounter on that path. If I need to be there at some point, maybe I can already see where I need to be in the meanwhile to reach that goal. And so what we are doing, I think, is somewhat comparable to map making with uncertainty on the map as well. Yeah, so exploring the future can help us to understand more or less attractive routes. It can help us to motivate to do the right thing. We can see which futures are attractive, which futures are not so attractive. It can help also to build consensus. We can look at different futures and see, okay, if this is what could happen, if we are indeed able to build the windmills, then we as Europe can agree that this is something that we want to go for. Yeah, I indicated that we need models in this, and models because we can help it use it as to describe the relationships a bit and to not have to do everything in our head. But what we often do is that we use a combination of storytelling and modeling. And the reason is that to some degree, the Earth consists of 3 layers of information. One is the physical entities. I'm not sure whether this is large enough in the back of the room to read, but we have the world of natural resources, of windmills, of things that we can touch. And all those things are nicely described with physical laws. And so their models are really good because we can simply use physical laws to describe them. We can use a physical law to describe the climate system. We can also track nicely how much power plants there are if you build new ones and if they are decommissioned. Then one layer above are the things that are of our human systems where we make choices. And so this is the world of rules and laws and behavior, where we have also some description of how things work. Economics can partly describe that system. Social sciences partly describe human behavior. And so we can have observations and we can see from the past how things happen under certain circumstances. These are slightly different from our physical laws because those are universal true. These have been true in the past, but they can change often. And then we have even one layer above, our beliefs and culture, where it's really hard to describe things in equations. And so that's why models are really helpful in that lower layer, while in the upper layer, actually words are stronger. And so we can describe the future in terms of, I expect maybe people to start moving towards a more sustainable world, and they will change diet, and they are collaborating. And these things I can better describe in words than in numbers. But then maybe I can use my model to illustrate how such a world would look like, how it would work. And so it's the combination of a storyline and the calculations. And most of the integrated assessment models look something like this. And I think many of you are working on an integrated assessment model, but by definition, we call it an integrated assessment model if it somehow describes both the human system and the Earth system and the interactions. Most of these models have somewhere in the human system a representation of economics and population and technology. And then many of the models have a detailed description of the energy system, and some also have a description of the land use system. And then on the Earth system, it depends a bit on how detailed models are. Some have simply a focus on climate, but some have also pollution or ecosystem dynamics or biogeochemical cycles in there as well. And then it's about the interaction. So from the human system to the Earth system, it's emissions and land use, for instance, that interact with the Earth system. And then from the Earth system back to the human system, we have environmental feedbacks. And so this is basically how nearly any integrated assessment model looks like. I think we have more or less at least 4 types of integrated assessment models that one can recognize. First of all, there are these cost-benefit integrated assessment models, so like DICE. They are extremely simple in terms of they mostly have maybe around 10, 20 main equations. You can solve them, and they typically are used to find an optimal path towards a certain goal and to play around. The nice thing about them is that they're really transparent. And so often they are used to make a point about what happens if you change the discount rate or things like that. Then we have these process-based IAMs, which are these much larger models that really try to describe the energy system and land use in much more detail. And actually, I think there are also 3 families within that process-based IAMs, those that actually started much more from a biophysical focus, those that really started from a much more economic focus, and then the ones that really started from an engineering model. And the last, for the last example, Mathijs is an example, the IASA model, that really was an engineering model of the energy system, and then expanded itself to become an integrated assessment model. Images and the model that we are using here is an example of the biophysical starting point. It started to have a biophysical description of the Earth system, more or less, and then more and more the human system was added to that. Yeah, and then economic focus, Remind Magpie started much more from an economic description, and which for certain. And then we also have these CGEs that also considered to be integrated assessment models, if they somehow have also a climate change estimate in there. So EVM might be considered to be part of the integrated assessment modeling community, but that's a very detailed computable general equilibrium model. Sorry for the abbreviation there. And then system dynamics models like international futures, they're also almost part of the family. They somehow are not often at, for instance, IMC conferences yet, but I think they more or less try to do the same thing as the other integrated assessment models. So I would say they're another part of the family. So model-based scenarios for climate change, they need to describe this whole chain of from starting from activities to energy and land use to emissions to greenhouse gas concentrations to climate change and to impacts. And that's more or less what you want to understand if you want to know the future of climate change. Partly because there are actions possible, policy possible in every single step of this chain. And we can adapt, starting at the end, we can adapt to impacts. We can possibly deal with climate change in form of solar radiation management or geoengineering. We can take greenhouse gases from the atmosphere with carbon dioxide removal. Emissions we can prevent partly with carbon capture and storage. We can change the energy system and move to windmills or to use energy more efficient, same for land. And then we can also change the human system. We can go for lifestyle change. We can move in towards more service-oriented or economy. We can even consider degrowth. And so we have options throughout that chain. And that means that we want to consider which of these options are the most attractive. And therefore, a system that actually describes the whole chain is very attractive because then we can weigh all these options against each other. Unfortunately, however, we see that actually in terms of research communities, the world is much more fragmented. So we have a research community that is mostly looking at the first three boxes, which are doing mitigation research. Then we have a research community that is pretty much looking into the Earth system. So that is the climate system research. And then we have an impact community. And so I think it would be really nice if that becomes a little bit closer to each other, because now we have also in the IPCC, we have working group 1, working group 2, working group 3, and they are quite separate. So integrated assessment models have been extremely successful, and they became the backbone. The scenarios that we created became the backbone of the IPCC reports. So already more than 20 years ago, you had the special report on emission scenarios from IPCC. It was called SRES, and that became an important part of the third and fourth assessment report. Then people developed the RCPs, which were used in the fifth assessment report. People developed the SSPs, which were used in the sixth assessment report. So they play a major role there. And one of the reasons why they play a major role is that because they link the different working groups. They are used in all working groups. And so it's one of the few things that really ties up the knot. We also see that many policy documents have an IAM input. If you simply look at EU policy, every time a new policy is introduced at the EU level, it needs to have an impact assessment. And that is often based on integrated assessment work. It plays a major role in there. Even if you look at the Paris Agreement, and the formulation of this going to zero in the mid-century and then moving to negative emissions, that text really resembles pretty well the RCP 2.6, which was at the time the lowest scenario that people could look at. And so you can see that probably that RCP 2.6 influenced the way that the Paris Agreement was formulated. And there's an enormous amount of literature. If you just look at the SSPs, I think people counted about 9,000 papers that were based on the SSPs alone. And so we also scientifically play a major role. That graph here, made in the paper from Lisette van Beek, actually shows we looked at the synthesis, the summary of the synthesis report of IPCC, and then looked at what share was actually based on integrated assessment models. And so this is the AR4 and this is AR5. And then we believe that the figures in the report, 20% was simply based on the integrated assessment models. And so successful field of research. But there's also a critique. So first of all, if you look at critique, there's a lot about people complaining about certain options. So if you don't like the option that is proposed by an integrated assessment model, you could critique the integrated assessment model. And so one of them is one really important discussion is about BECCS, bioenergy and CCS. Models like it a lot. Yeah, so if you tell the model there's an option that can actually remove CO2 from the atmosphere, and yeah, it is costly, but it's costly at a price that you will reach anyway because you have hard to abate sectors. And then if you give the models 100 or 200 exajoules of bioenergy, it's used it somehow in this combination with BECCS. And so the logical outcome from the model is I don't think is this should be really disputed. The question is how much land do you want to really use for bioenergy, of course. And yeah, you could also have some discussion about the fact that we don't have the technique yet, and it plays such a major role. There's also a critique on outdated assumptions. So we are often in the policy debate. We often publish scenarios that are used for a while, and therefore for technologies that move really, really fast, you do easily risk that you're slightly pessimistic. So the major example is PV, where every time people make comparisons of how our scenarios looked compared to what really happened, that we're constantly a little bit behind. So another major form of critique is the black box problem. And that is, yeah, these models are complicated. And so you could put a description of how they work, but yeah, people still need to read that. Then even if you publish the model code, still people find it difficult to go through that model code. And so it's a real problem. I was not only mentioning it as a critique back to the people that gave this critique. How do you make sure that your research is transparent enough for somebody else to appreciate what you're doing? And so that's another form of critique. And then the two things that we want to focus on this week are specifically the fact that most of the integrated assessment models, the process integrated assessment models, do not really include impacts. And so we would like this week, obviously, to discuss a bit, can this be done better? Anyway, how do we research impacts, things like that. And the second one is that equity and justice are not really well covered in the integrated assessment literature of the last years. And there I think I have to indicate that this is partly also simply a result of research focus. And so if we go back all the way to around 2005 or so, people were working towards a binding agreement on climate change. And that was going to be happening in Copenhagen. At that time, people were really well aware that we need to have national targets, binding national targets. And therefore, people were also aware that this needs to be just. And so there was quite some literature at that time about justice in relation to target setting. The whole thing failed because people became really defensive if you have to have a national binding target. And then Paris was an answer to that. In Paris, the idea was, okay, we don't set binding national targets. Instead, we set a binding target for the world as a whole. Nice. We now have we can agree on that. And then we say that we have voluntary contributions to reach this. Yeah, so this is really nice way to solve things. But in the end, people were already in 2015 in the Paris Agreement expecting that maybe all these voluntary contributions would not add up. And so they built up this stock take process that to see where we're going. And then if you then conclude that we're collectively not doing enough, the whole discussion about who has to do more all of a sudden becomes really important again. And that's what happened in the last few years. So with integrated assessment modeling, around 2015, we started to focus really strongly on is 1.5 feasible? And we more or less made the same move of looking pretty much to the world as a whole and see it as a global problem. Can we reach 1.5 and under which conditions and what role do certain technologies play? We more or less left out that issue about who has to do what. Now it's hunting us a bit because people are critiquing that we did not do that. Yeah, okay, thank you. You guys also were not focusing on something different. But now, yes, we really have to pick up this issue again and make it a major part of our research. So the next few slides are going to be a little bit about this impacts and equity as a quick introduction into what we will be covering in many presentations later this week. So first of all, impacts are not included. And that is partly because traditionally process-based IAMs are focused on mitigation. And so we have impacts in this cost-benefit IAMs, but the IAMs that the ones that were most visible, I guess, in the last decade, they are mitigation focused. And in the SSPs and RCPs, we actually decided deliberately that we didn't want to have any impacts. So even in the models that could model impacts, we asked them to shut that down. And the reason is that we first developed the SSPs, RCPs with the integrated assessment models. We give the emission and land use to the big climate models, the biophysical models that calculate then temperature and precipitation fields and things like that, which are then given to the impact community to calculate impacts. We were simply, and we are still, a little bit uncertain if we would include the impacts already in the integrated assessment models, that you're more or less double counting. The impact would be in the first step and in the third step. And so we thought it was much easier to not include them, and then at least have something that is conceptually easier to understand. We have a world description without impacts, and then in the end we estimate what the impacts would be without changing the original scenario. And another reason maybe to not include impacts is that especially the feedbacks from impacts on population, on economic development, on the things that we model well, is very uncertain. And so it would blow up pretty much some of our projections. And so that might be another reason why we decided not to make. But yeah, it is also it feels awkward. And so if we are saying to everybody, climate change is really relevant, why are we not including climate change then in our description of the future? We include so many things and not climate. Second, climate can impact mitigation. And so maybe some of the options that we propose, like afforestation, are not the best options if you recognize that climate can have possibly an impact on forest fires or on forest growth. And so maybe this is not the best option. So you want to take climate into account. And then, the other last point is that if we focus only on mitigation, then reaching 1.5 sounds like, oh, it costs only about 2% of GDP. Yeah, it doesn't cost 2% of GDP. It also prevents a couple of percent of GDP of damage. And so we tend to show half the story. And so the whole story becomes about cost instead of the benefits that actually climate policy has. Yeah, so there are papers that make this relevant. So this is a paper by a colleague that was working with us on the climate impacts on renewables. And so all the red areas are where there is a negative impact on renewables, all the blue areas is a positive impact. And so you see that in principle, because of changes in precipitation or changes in solar radiation, there is an impact on renewables that is interesting to take into account. Yeah, and there could also be a major impact on economic growth. This is Mimosa. You will see that later this workshop as well. But it's a DICE type of model where we look at human activity, then on the environmental consequences, then we monitorize those damages, which are then influencing welfare and the cost that you make to prevent the damage is taken out of your economic growth. And so in this paper that was published by Kai, who will be presenting later this week, he calculates that there are very substantial damages of climate change in the order of tens of GDP, percent of GDP in the regions. It's also not equal. Those damages are mostly in the global south and not in the global north. So it's related to this equity discussion. Therefore, actually, it's economically attractive almost in all scenarios to go to 1.5 degrees. And so the paper, if you really want to know, so because I'm not going to discuss this in detail, but by including the damages and using the latest information on damage curves, he shows that almost in all circumstances, independent of the discount rate, you favor going as low as possible. Yeah, so there's this idea that we would like to close the loop, and this is the image model. It's in or whatever. It's the representation of a generic integrated assessment model, and then in this case we have a paper under review where we did include the climate impacts on land cover and the climate impacts on the yields. On the cooling and heating demands or friendly, the ones of the renewable energy potential from the graph that I showed earlier, on the labor productivity, and also on biodiversity. And so we and other models are now trying to in more and more have this linear thing that I showed before, from activities to impacts, to make it kind of a circle. Yeah, and that would also allow us then to have in one graph an idea of emission pathways, cost, but also benefits. Now going to equity or justice, I'm using these words for similar purpose. They are not completely the same, but so if you want, you read justice as well. So why is justice crucial in climate policy? Because we have differences in historical contribution. Then also we have differences in the capacity to reduce emissions. And so some countries are rich, some countries are poor. Then there are differences in impacts. I showed this graph of Kai, where he showed how the impacts are not distributed equally across the world, and we expect much stronger impacts in the global south than in the global north. And then, obviously, there are also different consequences of mitigation. For instance, within a country, so if you are a coal miner, you have a very different consequence of climate mitigation than if you were working in the PV industries. And if you have a low income here, for instance, even in Europe, energy is a much greater part of your total budget than if you're richer. And so also there, we experience the consequences of mitigation in different ways. And so that is, obviously gives also a justice-related impact. And yeah, this is crucial because we know that people are much more likely to accept climate policy if they experience it to be just. And it's maybe formulated the other way around. People are not going to accept something that they feel is unjust. And we've seen that in the past with the yellow jersey movement in France. Whether they were correct or not correct, they experienced some form of climate policy raising petrol cost as being unjust. And so they all went into the streets. And they were able to block that. And obviously, now we see also discussions already between the global north and the global south on who has to do what, on the possible finance that would help global south, or even on measures that are proposed. So in Europe, we're now discussing this carbon trade adjustment mechanism, CBAM, and it's a tax at the border of the EU to make sure that steel that comes from outside the EU has a similar carbon tax as the steel that is produced within the EU. Yeah, countries outside the EU see this as some form of a tariff, and so they're angry about this. And so again, there's a justice discussion here, whether this is acceptable or not. Yeah, so sorry for the Dutch here, but just to indicate how important differences are. So we have China, United States, India, EU, Brazil, Indonesia, Japan, and Saudi Arabia. And the top graph shows you the total emissions at the moment. And so China is about, I think it's now getting close to 25-30% of global emissions. And then we have the United States, India, and the EU, more or less just below 10% of global emissions. And so it's clear that if we want to solve the problem, India has to be part of the solution. And because we will never go to net zero with a country that is close to 10% of the emissions not taking action. And so this is one perspective. But then the next perspective is the emissions per capita. And you can see how India is maybe at an eighth of the per capita emissions of the United States. And the EU also being much higher. And so clearly, you can also see the perspective from India saying, hey, maybe for us, development is a slightly more important issue than emissions, because emissions per capita are very low. To make things matter even more complicated, these are the cumulative emissions from the past since 1850, and there the differences are even more striking. Yeah? It's United States, EU, and to some degree China that mostly have caused the problem in the past. And so you can imagine that some of these countries are not saying that we would be the first to start climate policy. So we directly have a big justice debate here. There's a nice paper by Caroline Zinn that tries to at least make an overview of all these relationships in justice. So she tries to discuss that we have justice issues of mitigation, impact, tries to classify things. One thing is that she indicates that we have more or less 5 important dimensions of justice related to one, distribution, for instance, the distribution of effort. And second, we have a procedural justice issue. How do we make sure that everybody who is impacted by either climate change or climate policy is also included in the discussions? We have a corrective justice issue. So some people have caused damage and can be repair that. In environmental law here in Europe, and we have this polluter pays principle. If you have caused and did harm to somebody, you can be liable for correction. Recognitional justice, which is some connection with your area or your the people around you, and transformational justice related to the transformation itself and how that impacts certain groups. And then on distributive justice, we have different ways how we could potentially share the remaining carbon cake. And 3 principles that we can think of are responsibility, and so who has caused the problem, equality, and so we're all equal, so maybe we should divide the remaining carbon cake equally, or capacity, and so who can do most, and who has the strongest shoulders, because the strongest shoulders have to carry the biggest weight. I've listed 2 other ways you could think of sharing the cake, which are not necessarily just, but at least they are ways to share the cake. And so you could have grandfathering, very used to share the cake based on how it's shared right now. And you could share the cake in the most cost-effective way. So because they play a role as well in discussions, listed here them as well, realize that they are not necessarily of interest yet. No, it's more or less the opposite, but I will try to explain it again. So if you say responsibility, then I would recognize the fact that the EU has caused, and the United States have caused the most important part of the problem. So I could, for instance, calculate how much they already used parts of the cake, and therefore I give them a much smaller part of the cake to compensate for the fact that they ate already the biggest part. With grandfather, I do the opposite. What I do is that I say, okay, everybody gets, the world has to go down 80%, everybody gets an 80% emission reduction. And then everybody, it sounds very equal, so everybody 80%, but that means that you leave the current injustices untouched. Yeah, so this is a paper you might want to look it up as well. That was recently published where people were arguing how important it is to include equity, so they are indicating the solution space and then indicating that maybe only one part, a certain part of the solution space is relevant, which complies to justice principles. This is the last slide. Yeah, the point that I wanted to make here is that we don't only have climate problems, and so there's also a justice dimension. Means that if we try to solve the climate problem but shift the burden to another issue, that is also not helping, because at some point that the issue is also harming somebody else. And so if we are, for instance, solving climate change by having a lot of bioenergy and therefore potentially reducing biodiversity, that doesn't sound like a very good idea. Similarly, maybe you have to think maybe things like water use, for instance. And so this is more or less this planetary boundary graph of Johan Rutström again. The only thing is that we didn't, in this case, have current data, but this is the outcome of the image model. And we calculated the outcome for planetary boundaries in 2015. And then in 2050, when we followed the SSP2 scenario. But what you can see is that things unfortunately became worse for many of these environmental problems, not only climate change, but also for most of the others, except for air pollution, which more or less remained stable. It shifted in location, and ozone depletion, which actually improved. But then, can we do better? And yes, in this case, we calculated also solution pathways for the other planetary boundaries, including climate policy. And then we had some trade-offs. But then when we introduced further policies related to efficiency and diet change, actually, we were able to move to a much better situation. But then we did not account for the fact that there is another problem in the world, which is that about 2 billion people have no access to electricity. Slightly less than 1 billion have no access to sufficient food. And so, can you be on this pathway without solving the development issue? Probably not. And so, what we have not done, what we would like to be doing in the future, is to start looking into decent living standards. There's a very nice paper from 2018 by Narasimha Rao that tries to define decent living standards. That is way beyond the minimum conditions to just survive. So he wants to formulate something that is decent. And then for food, for shelter, for water, for transport, but it's not independent of this story. Because if we indeed would make sure that people are moved to a much better situation with respect to food globally, obviously it has a consequence potentially of the amount of food that we need to produce if we don't redistribute. We do redistribute, but we do not have to include increase in agricultural production. But then we need to somehow think of how to do that. And so again, just major justice issues related to how we combine decent living standards and the planetary boundaries. The last slide is the SSPs that we formulated in 2016. So we have these 5 different possible routes for the world. And in some of them, it's clear that we can have justice as a major part of our discussions. In SSP1, sustainability, in SSP2, obviously, we need to do it as well. We see the world at the moment, obviously, also moving towards a direction that might be much more considered to be SSP3, where many countries are now focusing on security and where openly power is getting more important share of the discussions than justice. And while I think last year or 2 years ago, people would like to, we had UNFCCC has been only taken down where we will have international climate policy. Now, with the US stepping out, we have to find new mechanisms in addition to UNFCCC to make sure the climate policy still works. But you also saw that last year, if you wanted to get something in UNFCCC, you would argue based on justice. And now you see countries also arguing on the basis of power. And so we have to realize that those are changing and see how some of our discussions fit fall into this. And so finally, some lessons from this whole presentation. Integrated assessment models are, I think, an important tool, but they constantly need to be improved, just like anything else. So we have to adapt to how the situation around us is changing. Improvement is possible, including the representation of justice and impacts. And this week we will discuss this quite a lot in detail. Yeah, I think you guys, how the week evolves is partly depending on the lectures in the morning, but even much more with all this group work in the afternoon. And so whether it's successful or not, in the end, it depends pretty much on what you make out of it. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. So also because of my, so there's some issues this morning, which you always have. We're a bit later, but it's fine. We have room for a few questions, and then your session starts to go like 10 minutes later, and we have a break of half an hour, so we can catch up. And what I didn't mention before also is that everything is recorded, so I'll do that via Teams link. Also make some minutes. But I think more importantly, all the presentation will also be available, right? So yeah, you don't have to sort of rewrite the sheet that you see. Yeah, I think that's it. But then we have room for a few questions, if there are. Maybe yeah.
I would actually just have a very stupid question, but you mentioned this one paper which was trying to find decent living standards. What was the name of the paper?
Yeah, the last name is Rao, R-A-O. It's somebody from India, but he is now working at Yale in the US. His first name, that is Narasimha. With N-A-R-R-I-S. Narishima.
Should be able to find it.
What's that?
Oh, it's good.
In combination with decent living standards will work. If you Google.
I had a question based on what you said. If it's maybe more an opinion, if you think it's better to try to include these justice and social implications into the models, or to come up with some sort of model pipeline to decompose, because these models are already so complex. I mean, they're not climate models, but they take some time to run, and then they're constantly really criticized regarding easy to use and not.
Yes.
More layers make it be more complex.
Yeah. So I think somehow linking it to the research would be perfect. And so that could mean that you do things with target setting outside the model, the main model, in a transparent way, but then use those targets in model calculations. And for instance, then look at what would it mean to reach those targets domestically? What would it mean if you allow for some form of trade? What kind of finance flows would be the consequence? Nico might say in something about that.
About what?
About the financial flows that you could calculate in a model as a consequence.
No, not exactly.
Okay, yes, paper users. Yeah, but yeah, I agree with you. It doesn't. Not everything needs to be in the model. We can also build things and do research with the model results or next to the model.
Because you mentioned in your critique is like outdated assumptions. And I was wondering if there are any ideas of like changing parts of the models, because in my research I was looking at resilience specifically, and what I found is that like the economic models, which are like the CGE based models, basically, they're bad in like assessing resilience because they can't see those cascading losses, and it's like exaggerated feedback. So I was wondering, is there any ideas of integrating different kinds of economic models into the science at the moment?
I think, yes. So people are dealing with this in different ways. So we have projects on alternative growth models. I assume that some of the more the non-CGE economic growth models that are already included in IAMs should be able to also capture direct impacts back to economic growth. So yes, in some projects this is an issue.
I was wondering, more about this double accounting impacts. For example, whereas in Atlas models, it makes it difficult on how to lenders need to force you with impacts or not. And we actually had discussions about it based on the scenario B, and upcoming scenario. So I just mentioned like a server setting of this double accounting.
In scenario MIP, when we were designing it like 3 years ago or something like that, we actually were thinking of creating two sets. So one with impacts and one without impacts included. In the end, we completely ran out of time, and so it was, and most of them, and several of the models were not ready. But maybe that is a solution, so that people can choose which one they would find best. If you want to see how IAMs would have looks like if it had closed the circle, you can use that one set. You could use the first set if you think that you want to avoid double counting. Yeah, another option is that in the end we merge at some point the impact research community and the IAM community. And so if impact research is done in the context closer to the integrated assessment models, maybe that will solve things as well.
Professor, may I ask, how do you think if we can include some micro foundation into the IAMs? Because my major is economics, and some economics model will even the macroeconomics model will put some individual behavior, like consumer utility maximum, and I was wondering if we can combine some individual data set into the model. Maybe it can better capture some heterogeneity. But I was wondering, and because IAMs often focus on the macroeconomics, so I have no idea about how to include some individual behavior or macro foundation into it.
Yeah. So I think to some degree, many of the processes that underlie the macro things that we mostly focus on in integrated system models are directly influenced by micro decisions. So, and whether we have energy efficiency is an individual household decision towards on the basis of energy prices, and the person has an expectation for the future and decides to buy or not insulation. And so understanding how these micro processes work, I think is important. And either you try to capture these micro processes in some form of generic rules that you include into the macro model, which is the way that we might have tried to do things in the past. Or alternatively, maybe you can include micro models into the context of an IAM. What you risk is making things even more complicated. But for individual studies, I think it is interesting. And yeah, maybe also we so far have been, my generation have been thinking of the capabilities with code before AI and before all kinds of. There are obviously now a lot of other opportunities that might generate different models, which I have no idea about. Yeah.
Last question.
Very short question. I just wanted to understand more about the image model. Also, if you could talk a bit about the data used, because you talk about the biophysical accounts. I'm really interested to know which are reliable data sources to biophysical accounting, especially for phosphorus and nitrogen. My understanding is the data are not accurate. If you could speak.
Yeah, so I can speak to as much as I know, because I'm not an expert on phosphorus and nitrogen. But I think for us integrated system modelers, data is a big issue. So there are a few areas where we have standardized international data, and therefore we can easily use that. And for energy, we have the IEA, International Energy Agency. For land, we have the FAO. For emissions, we have a few databases like EDGAR. Most of our models need more. So we need transport, we need the amount of cars, and just go to your example. But there's no international database that is for similar quality for transport. And then if there is, it is inconsistent with the IEA and energy data. And so we try to find stuff in papers or in individual databases, and then we have all these inconsistent data sets. And so that is a big issue. On phosphorus and nitrogen, I personally don't know exactly what kind of data is available. My colleague Arthur Deusen is the person that is working on that part of the model. I think to some degree it's the models that generate to some degree maybe some of the data based on assumptions on fertilizer application and things like that. But if you really want to know more, you could see whether you can contact Arthur Deusen. Yeah.
Okay. Move to the next speakers.
We should have used the time of the questions to already get yours.
Yeah. It's good. We report all the answers, so that's also.
You want it?
you would be sure on laptop now.
I can also.
But you're doing it together with Elina, right? Yeah, and she's, I don't know, will start or how you would. I mean, I'm happy to use mine as well.
Oh, do you want you were expecting to use my laptop?
No. Well, I thought this. I'm using a laptop that is here, not your laptop. I
Yeah.
know that it is yours. So I guess if I plug in here,
Sure, should work. And does it work out with
no, it
Oh,
not.
okay. It's fine. We can also, we have the notifications and then we just recording for the.
No, but Elina has to be on Teams.
Yes, we're later. We because presentation while presenting.
Okay.
Then, but it's fine. So Nico Bouwers, our very esteemed colleague from Sun. Elina is online. Elina Trutschen, probably pronouncing correctly, reports that Janata is an energy expert there. Already reject all trades. Also, there's a lot about equity, finance, but energy in general. And how we have done this for far before my time. And I am a little bit too long.
Can you speak up, Elina? Can we test?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you on laptop on.
Can you say something? So I think it's sort of being said. Need from share. Yeah, the seat was one. It's not hearing it because now we don't have laptop for it. Elina, can you say something?
How about now? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, maybe make your laptop very loud.
And we can hear you, but we should hear over speaker. That's
We have to organize it in the break again.
yeah. But it did work with your laptop.
No.
Is this one?
Yeah, so.
But this one, you see, you just the link I had.
Okay. But that one only goes to solution because that actually they were so you know. But that one will. Let's do it now.
It's my smile. So it's shit.
There's 80 row?
Okay, yeah, because just the password in it.
The steady roam has this password that you take from your own institute.
Almost there.
But
And there's nothing else.
some songs I did which but the other thing is so was like once.
You can try it for the Avian. If the Solus ID, try that for the password and the login to the Avian. Because that should work if that's one.
So I started my diploma in 2000 on the side of impacts with extreme events, climate extreme events. And I used back then the DICE model, so very simplified macroeconomic model with very, very high level simplified damage functions and mitigation functions.
Can I do one check if this is now okay? Then we're, if they can hear us and if they can also speak, say something.
Yes, sounds good for me.
Okay,
Do you also
well,
hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, we could still not hear it over speakers, so that's a bit odd. Did you use this cable?
For what?
For when your laptop worked with
I used that one, yeah.
this one?
Yeah.
Yeah, so let me just one more and then, because it's nice if we can hear them well.
So this model with a very simplified functions. But then the idea was, this is also uncertain and incomplete. And rather, let's go with some environmental standards, setting limits, and ask the question how to get best there with emission reductions, rather than caring too much on the impact side. So now the impacts came back, and now we are caring more and more and more again about how to model impacts in these models. So one thing that is not going to dissipate is, unfortunately, the uncertainty side of things. So the whole discussion you can expect to be still being dominated by uncertainty. So the ranges are really, really, really large. And we have also then somehow to make it part of the problem. Yeah. And now I tried to give you some deep dives into this modeling of the impacts. On Thursday, I will give another presentation on the mitigation side of things, what we are doing mostly there. Yeah. But today is more on the impacts and equity side. And here I also got some help from my dear colleagues, Jareh and Inga. Part of their work is going to be presented here as well. So I do a very simplified. Why is it not working?
Well, just an error.
Okay, I differentiate two very simple dimensions. The intragenerational equity and fairness issue, which is usually mostly in the literature related to the mitigation side of things. Yeah? There is a turn going also more into the impacts side. And what I put up here is a formula for the fair wage. It's nearly 200 years old by an economist called Johann Heinrich von Thünen. And he was so proud of it, they put it into his gravestone. So I even went there because it is not so far away from Potsdam. So this is a photograph on my own. And the funny thing is, so it is very easy. Yeah, it's like the E equals M times C squared by Einstein. But that is even before a simple formula for equity and fairness. The problem is, as soon as we go into integrated assessment models, things become really messy and they are not that easy anymore. Yeah. What is also funny, he has here the square roots. This has to do with the utility function that has a negative curvature. So additional consumption gives you less enjoyment. And the lower your income is, the more important is it that you have more consumption. Yeah. This is related to the square root that is already nearly 200 years ago. So the other thing is the intergeneral fairness and equity. And here I put up Cookie Monster because also Detlef referred to sharing a cookie, which is very important in fairness things. And so Cookie Monster has no sense of the future and that he should care about the future. He eats all the cookies now. He has a discounting rate of about 100% per second. So he does not save anything. He doesn't care about what his today's actions mean for the future. And we will come back to this. And the point is that as soon as we think about impacts in intra-generational issues, you will see that in the future, and the impacts have something to do mostly with the future. There's also going to be distributional implications. Yeah. So the intragenerational is not only today, it will also affect the future. And this makes these two dimensions to be dependent on each other. Yeah, you cannot really separate them. And this is what has been done so far a lot. And this is the reason why the intra-generational fairness is usually associated with mitigation or not the impacts. Yeah. Okay. So this is a study that we did. We used the Remind Magpie model and computed some mitigation scenarios with and without an overshoot of 1.5 degrees. And then we took the results and fed it through a series of models. A climate model, a so-called Earth system model of intermediate complexity. So it does not have internal variability and it is rather reduced, but you can do it very quickly. Then we took these results, put them through an ice sheet model to compute sea level rise, a land use model. Edna is also quite familiar with the LPJML model. So to compute influences on land use and vegetation carbon pools. Then we used also damage functions, yeah, the response of GDP, and we put the things through a easy impact model to look for the lifetime exposure to extreme events like heat waves. Yeah? And later on, so first I will show you part of this, then of this. Then we go into this also to see how we computed things there. And yeah. What also was a major result of the study was that it's very important to take a differentiated look into the temporal and the spatial or regional, national variations, yeah. And to do this for the climate, the environmental, and the socio-economic systems. And in the end, the study showed that the trade-off between impacts and mitigation, yeah, the investment to avoid future impacts by mitigation, this trade-off is much more severe in developing countries than in developed countries. Yeah, and this is an overriding theme that we will get back in this discussion, not only today, but in the coming years. Okay, so you can see some of the results. So this is a scenario with overshoot and without overshoot. You see the rate of decrease of the emissions is very different. And in order to comply with the same carbon budget over time, you have balancing here in the end with super negative emissions in the overshoot scenarios and less so in the non-overshoot scenario. So this is how much overshoot you're doing in gigatons per CO2. So how much do you exceed the carbon budget? This is now important for the mitigation side of things, because you see at the global level, in the non-overshoot case, we have here a super large increase in the beginning, and then it drops down. Whereas in the overshoot case, it is much slower at the beginning, but then it becomes a little more expensive here at the end. And this has here to do with an intertemporal allocation of the mitigation costs. Yeah? Earlier, high costs, and later less, or the other way around. Important is this also very, the distribution across OECD, developed countries, and non-OECD is very unequal. So the non-OECD countries have the much higher costs of mitigation. Yeah. And much more so in non-overshoot case. Yeah, it avoids more damages. Yeah, also for the developing countries, but they would also have the higher cost. This is so to say how much of carbon dioxide removal is done without an overshoot and with big overshoot. And you can see the total amount is not so much different. Yeah, the allocation varies, but also in the non-overshoot case, you do a lot of CDR. Yeah, so that this is not so sensitive to the overshoot question, yes or no. Okay. So these are now some reactions of the climate system that we looked at with the UVic model. And important here is you have legacy effects. Yeah. So we have here a maximum difference of about 0.35 degree at max. And then in 2100, when the carbon budgets is exactly the same in both scenarios, there's still some legacy. So the temperature in the overshoot case is 20% higher. Or 20% of this difference is still left in 2100. For the carbon budget, the number is 0, basically. Okay? So then the ocean heat content, 90% is still in the ocean, yeah, of the peak, because the ocean saves the energy. Yeah. So atmospheric temperature very quick, ocean very slow, very inert. This then also has an impact on the sea level rise. Yeah, the ocean expands, sea level rises, and up until today, this is the major driver of sea level rise, not the ice sheet melting. What we also have is meridional overturning, so ocean currents are decreasing, and there's hardly any reversibility in this indicator. Also here, Arctic sea ice area is very inert. A global precipitation that should be 100%, there's something missing. So there's legacy effects, yeah, and some of them are very long term. If we look at impacts, later on I will show you a little better how we computed this. So what are we seeing? This is the impact on the expected biographies. So how many heat waves does a person experience over the course of their lifetime? Huh? And older persons born in 1960 will have a much smaller number of heat waves to experience over their lifetime than those who are born in 2020 because of the global warming effect. Yeah. So here you can see the difference between the two scenarios, and that means people living today, depending on their age cohort, will be affected over their respective lifetime in a very, very different way. Yeah. So the younger bear the cost of these impacts much more. And this is even without the overshoot, but with overshoot, you get an additional effect. Yeah. What we see here is for the developing country, this is the low-income countries, this effect is even larger than for the high-income countries. This is now the GDP response. And here, a very, very important parameter and the big uncertainty is, what is the half-time? So the immediate GDP impact is, so to say, not the big problem, but how long is the echo effect that you have in the aftermath? And a half-time of 0 or infinity, 5 and 15 years. So most people believe it is somewhere between these two. Yeah, makes a huge difference. So the GDP losses can vary quite by a margin globally. Here. If the half-time is only 5 years, then most of the effect overall is not that large, and it is mostly reversible by 2100. With 15 years, it is much higher, and the reversibility is less. And if the effects are, so to say, with an infinite lifetime, then it is much, much higher, 20%. That's quite a bit. And we have a much larger impact of this relatively small overshoot. In the non-OECD countries, this effect is also larger.
And you started later, and just to know, in interest of time, assuming that Elina has just as much time as you, how much time do you think you still need?
Oh, too much.
And so I think, like,
I'm
already going towards the end.
How much time do you give me?
So now 15 minutes. Yeah.
Okay.
15 minutes will be great.
Oh, that's going to be very difficult. Okay, intergenerational discounting. We have a discount factor that you can see down here. And this is the value of future damages today. Yeah, it's just basically the opposite of an interest rate that scales up. The discounting rate scales down. And here you can see $1,000 today after 100 years with a discount rate of 1, 4, or 7% is worth much less. Yeah, and at 4%, it's only a fifth damage that you do or that you suffer in 2100. You can also have a varying discount rate as the if you have the uncertainty to lose either 1 or 7%, then you can make the average of the two. Then the discount rate is time varying. And in the end, you have these relatively high residual damages still. Yeah, the social cost of carbon. So today, the emission of 1 ton of CO2, what does it cost? And you have the damages that accrue over time. But you devalue them by the discount rate. And then the social costs of carbon are taken into account this discounting. So when we want to derive the social cost of carbon from a model like the DICE model, we have a welfare function where the pure rate of time preference is here. The discount rate, however, is the pure rate of time preference, the technological progress of the economy and the growth rate of the population. And this is then here the discount rate. Yeah. So make the distinction between the pure rate of time preference and the discount rate or long-term interest rate. There has been a lot of discussions about this parameter being 1% or not 0.1% or 3%. Yeah. So you can derive this social cost of carbon from a cost-benefit analysis where you have the mitigation cost, the damage cost, and then you compute the total cost and where's the minimum needs to be evaluated, and then so to say the value of reducing 1 ton CO2 is your social cost of carbon in the static variant. And this very simple logic has been implemented in the DICE model. Yeah. So this is literally how it is written in DICE. Yeah. This within a dynamic context. And then you get temperatures. You can have a base case without any investigation, or an optimal case, or some other cases, and you can see very, very, very tiny variations only. And this is what made a lot of people very upset. I can also take a look at the social cost of carbon. Over time, it increased, yeah, because the damage estimates increased. But here you can also see the impact of uncertainty already. Yeah? And these numbers are not so super high, I would say. Okay. This is a study from the EPA that was then also policy relevant, and they derived the social cost of carbon for different models and the different discounting rates. And here you can see a 3%, $43 per ton of CO2. This is about somewhat more than the doubling of the price of coal. Yeah. Coal, not oil. Oil is hardly affected by $43 per ton of CO2. But what you also can see is this super large uncertainty range. Yeah, I mean, this covers really a lot of the overall space. Yeah. So for impact assessment and how to estimate the impacts, there's basically two approaches. One is a process-based modeling approach. You go through a whole set of models step by step by step by step, like you go from increasing temperature to yield losses to agricultural production, and then you even can monetize this by putting it through a general equilibrium model, and in the end you can look at the impact of GDP. Usually the outcome of these models is the impact of climate change on GDP is relatively small. There's the other approach, the econometric or climate econometric approach, and there you simply take weather and economic data and make regressions. And the interesting thing is and you take variations of temperatures and the responses of fluctuations from GDP. And independent of each other, a lot of different studies have shown that this reveals very strong impacts of GDP to climate change. Big thing is, how do we bring these two together? Also, how do we include equality or heterogeneity in this approach and this approach? I'm going to show you for both how it works and how we get to the this in. I jump over this very quickly, although that's very interesting. So the process-based approach. So we have the climate forces from the RCP. So Detlef is the main author. We put this through Earth system models, climate models, and get a temperature response. Okay? This is the basis for all different kinds of impact studies. We can look for weather extremes. Yeah? We can look for threshold values like recurrence times. Yeah? Heat wave every 100 years. When does it become, at what temperature, global mean temperature, does it become the 50-year or the 10-year event? Yeah? And this can then be derived from the output of these models. And then you get for the heat waves, how much percent of the land experiences increases for different temperatures, 1.5 to 3 degree. And here you see, especially here in the tropics, you get an increase of the areas affected by heat waves. We can combine this with population data also. And then, this is so to say the cohort-specific thing. You have the age in the year 2020. Here is the global mean temperature, so this one. You combine this with the population data, and then you get a multiplier that tells you how much more heat waves will be experienced if the temperature reaches 2 degree or 3 degree up until the year 2100. And this approach gives you this line that I showed you in the beginning. Yeah. Okay. This is the climate econometric approach. This is a recent study, and here you see for the RCP 2.6 or 8.5, and the climate model projection starting in 2020 with 0, how large is the impact? And you can see this is a hell lot of an impact on GDP. It's even larger than the one I showed you before. In comparison, this is the global mediation. This is by region. And you can see the terrible thing happens in the developing countries, especially around the equator. Yeah? They have much, much larger impacts than North America, Europe, and the former socialist countries even see some positive effects, yeah, or chances for positive effects. And the point is, developing countries are already hot. And if you put more temperature on them, the effect is larger. Yeah. I mean, heat waves here are terrible, but heat wave in India, that's something very good. Okay, why is that so large? It is because of a lag structure. Here's the year the event happens, and this is the lags that the effect holds on in the economy. And this means 8 years after the event, you still accumulate negative GDP responses. And this cumulative effect is the reason why this is so large. Yeah? If you leave that away, if you would cut out all that, these lines would be much, much smaller. Yeah? We can look for this also in terms of income deciles. So this is the recent work by a colleague. You can see the lower income deciles. So this is here the black one, the bottom 10 and the top 10. And here the slope is much larger. So the response for the poor people to climate anomalies is much larger than for the richer households. Yeah, and here you can see this is for the years from 1980 to 2019. So replication of history. It led to an increase, especially in developing countries, of a Gini index, and this is a measure of inequality. Yeah, climate change in northern hemisphere countries, we even see a decrease in Gini. So it's a very substantial difference. Let me run through some more slides. So this is a hybrid approach now, where we use this detailed climate data and an economic model. This is by my colleague Inga. She looked for the Philippines and tropical cyclones. And some households are not only hit every year by a cyclone, but multiple cyclones. So they are really under pressure. Poor households usually live in buildings with, according to a lower standard, and they even can fall below the poverty line, which brings them in really dire situations, even to reconstruct. So thus only partial recovery happens before the next shock occurs. And what they found is that partial recovery increases the damage and hits the poor the most. Yeah? Thus, the income loss not only results from the immediate effect, but it depends on the context, and the context has to do with the history of events. Yeah. Yeah, the fun fact I'll leave aside. Now, when we feed this back into the damages and how this is modeled in macroeconomic contexts, I should have mentioned earlier. So if you are credit constrained, or the bank says, I don't trust that you ever pay back the money, reconstruction also becomes very, very difficult for poor households. Yeah. So this is then the financial factor. Should have added this. So we can have now different ways of modeling the damage in the aggregate function. Either like DICE, total factor productivity. We can destroy capital. We can make labor not go to work or more inefficient. Yeah, these are the 4 channels. And then we can model the same shock on GDP. Yeah, we shock either here, 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 or here. And we model the same shock on GDP. And then we look at what happens. So the immediate effect, the one that you would observe immediately, is the same, but not what happens afterwards. And here you can see that especially this total factor productivity shock recovers the fastest. Yeah. And if we put the same damage in terms of GDP reduction on capital, the recovery is slower. And especially when we look for labor, yeah, recovery becomes much more dire and takes much more time. So it depends on exactly where in the model chain you put the damage. For the observable, immediately observable, it would be the same, but not what happens afterwards. And this has a lot to do with the savings rate. Yeah, this is now a macroeconomic variable, and how this feeds through the system. And then we can put it into the model and look for a longer term projection, what the effect is, and the effect is really large. So it depends not only how large quantitatively is the shock, but how you model it. And yeah, what that all means basically is you have these different modeling tools for the impacts and how to bring an inequity. And we have to come to a more integrated view of the inter and intra-generational equity issues, because treating them separately really does not make sense anymore in the context of this problem. Thank you.
So I hope it's easily solvable and we can hear it through the speakers, but thank you very much, Nico.
Yeah.
So I think this is perfect presentation to save also with lots of key concepts that people will hopefully also use this week.
The questions after the presentation as well.
Yeah, maybe a question now is actually perfect because then I can try to do this.
Yeah, you have to set up this.
Yeah.
Is somehow making the linkage of the cavity. So the fixed defect model and the likelihood model is just show the correlation in between the variable, but it's not is it not a correction about the casualty?
The casualty,
Yes.
the number of casualties.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. So I was just wondering if there were any questions about this kind of.
Yeah, the number of.
Can you guys try to say something?
Is an indicator that is.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect. Thanks. Very well. Very well.
In the model.
Okay.
There's a question that I try to answer quickly, and then you can jump in. Okay. All right. So in these models and the assessments, the number of casualties is a very difficult one, and people usually, or researchers usually shy away from this indicator.
Yeah.
So usually the indicators used in context of these health-related issues is risk of hunger, for example, or malnutrition. With years of life lost, or premature death, are indicators used. You can also ask the question, what is then in the term of monetary valuation, what is the value of the statistical life? Yeah. Usually we factor in the health component in heat waves, for example. Yeah. That is a very, very, very important component in the overall assessment. And I mean, there is lots of discussion about the use of value of a statistical life. But if you leave out this component, that's the most biggest part of the entire impact. And you would lose out, so to say, the most important argument. But the number of casualties, that's a figure that most people are not from. So it's more these putting people at risk, putting people in danger, shortening life. Is a indicator that is also established in the health. Okay. But in these indicators, there's also a lot of inequity and heterogeneity across the income level.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, the digital floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you so much. I hope now you can hear me well and see the slides. So I will give you a broader deep dive into perspective and especially into challenges that Detlef and Nico already pointed out. And generally, I wanted that you take away more or less 3 core points from this presentation. So first of all, that we again kind of take a step back and discuss some definitional issues about justice, that you get a bit of an overview of what are the issues in implementing justice in models and scenarios, or bringing in justice into models and scenarios. And then we will also briefly touch upon core issues and outlook. Okay, so what is actually justice? So as already mentioned by Detlef, quite often we use the terms justice, equity, and fairness actually quite interchangeably in research. But if you want to read a little bit more about this concept, especially some foundational thinking, I highly recommend the article by Grasso from 2007. And here he actually suggests to distinguish between justice, equity, and fairness. So justice is in a sort of way exists independently of the other concepts, and these are the foundational or moral principles that exist before action. And here lots of work overlaps with the philosophy community, because there are different justice theories and justice concepts, again, kind of or political of philosophy. So this is really what is right or deserve, giving the different theoretical perspectives. Equity is more about this implementation of certain justice principles. So these are normative criteria to implement justice. And this is quite often, I think, where we operate or operationalize justice. So here we think about how responsibility should be distributed. And fairness, on the other hand, is about perceived justice. So here quite often, especially I think in climate negotiations or when we interact also with stakeholders, it's a lot about whether something is perceived as just or not. And here we speak more about fairness. And also another work or reading that I would suggest, so as an article led by a colleague here at IASA, Carolina Zim. So here we thought together with especially with philosopher Kian Min-Soo about how to bring a little bit an order into the complexity of justice research and different concepts and frameworks. And we thought that, important first step is first to, I guess, answer the question, justice of what or area of justice. And here, of course, we already discussed kind of the two broader areas that we normally consider, such as adaptation and mitigation, also climate impacts, loss and damage. And I think overall, we look into these different areas that somehow can be linked to human well-being. The next step, analytical step that we take is also to clearly identify the scope of justice. So here we answer the question, at which scale is justice studied? And here, of course, we can also have many different kind of scopes in our research. So we can focus on different time periods, different cohorts or generations, and we could also have a different spatial resolution. So here we can look more at the global level versus regional and national. And as we know, there are quite often also quite some trade-offs by taking different spatial resolutions, or even possibly conflicting then implications from the fairness perspective. The next level, analytical level, what we suggest is the form of justice. So which form or dimension of justice is considered. And here we distinguish between distributional, procedural, corrective, recognitional, and transitional. And for example, what we again know the best or work with within the scenario community is within the so-called distributional justice and questions of equity, but more and more, especially by the mentioned criticisms of IAMs, also talk more about procedural justice, and here specifically focused on the models, the question who is involved in, for example, also even thinking of which research questions should be asked, and also in developing the narratives and the assumptions within the model, and also how easy, for example, is the access to research or to the development of models and scenarios. More and more, there are also questions of corrective justice. So here, related terms are also restorative and compensatory justice. Also within the next level, the next question is also which metrics or currencies, as we call it, so currency is more of the term from philosophy, are investigated. So how do we measure the different kind of outcomes? And here also some examples, and I think here we have really a super large number of combinations and indicators that we can look at. But here quite often we look at welfare implications, at health implications, nutrition implications, energy, GDP, and so on. So here I think it's also quite often important to be aware that this is again a complex system, a complex combination of different indicators. So it's a multidimensional concept that we can look into, and again, a certain scenario pathway can lead to many different implications along all these different matrices and indicators. And to complicate things even more, the final level that I think probably will be the newest to many of you, it was the newest for us, that comes more from the philosophy side, is the patterns of justice. And here the question is, again, what do we assume, for example, in terms of the differences across regions or even the individuals? So here, do we assume that everyone converges to a certain level, or do we assume that, so this would be more like egalitarian approach, or do we assume that everyone improves and we do not care so much kind of at which level we reach? Or do we care about that everybody is above a certain minimum? So this is more the sufficitarian pattern and so on. So I guess here we again have quite different understandings of or patterns of justice that we could again bring into our thinking. And also here the point is that, again, depending whom you ask and sort of within which field of work you work, different patterns would be perceived as fair. So here, I guess this is important for the fairness evaluations. And I think another study that I highly recommend, and that does quite good overview of the different communities and of different concepts that are relevant for the definition of justice is the work by the Earth Commission. So here they propose the Earth system justice approaches, and they propose the so-called 3 I's, so interspecies, intergenerational, and intra-generational justice. And here they basically tell us, again, specify, narrow it down a little bit more, what we should be looking into and analyze if we care about Earth system justice. And I guess here also for your work, the question is, do you want to focus on one of the I's, or do you also want to combine them and have a bit of a more holistic view? But again, if you're interested into understanding really a bit the different concepts and the different approaches that is out there, so this is also a great reading. And just very briefly, because I think we will focus much more into this throughout this week. So what is like some examples in terms of justice in models and scenarios? So first of all, also in the study that I already mentioned, there we did a little bit of a literature review in terms of which indicators or metrics of justice are quite well covered in the existing global IAM research, and also which patterns of distributions do we find there. And here one of the main findings was, as I already mentioned, that a lot is within this distributional dimension of justice. But as you can see that, of course, a lot of indicators, studies focus on emissions and economy. And for example, to some degree, energy and food are upcoming focus areas. But for example, metrics of health are yet not so well covered. And I think this also speaks to the point about impacts, right? Because we don't have yet this good connection to impacts. So this is why health is also not yet so well covered and explored within this distributive justice and global IAMs literature. And also in terms of patterns, we see that utilitarian and prioritarian, so where the assumptions that everyone simply improves or that we have this growth everywhere also dominate as compared, so for example, to sufficitarian or to limitarian approaches. So limitarian approaches is really more aligned with this degrowth thinking that we assume in that in certain, that there is overconsumption also in certain regions, and that it's possible also to limit consumptions, and that would be fair. And what really dominates the most literature, and you probably would know, are this what we call exposed approaches, focusing on the emissions. And so here just a very brief introduction, because you would also need this for your group work, but this would be covered in more detail by other colleagues. But here, sort of the most widespread application of different equity principles or fairness principles is by taking the outputs already from scenarios that we have and kind of calculating what would be given different principles and allocation rules, what would be, for example, the implied emissions for a certain regions or implied investment. So here the assumption is that even if, for example, based on a scenario output, lots of mitigation should happen in the developing world, we can calculate the necessary investments from the developed world based different equity principles and kind of balance this out from the fairness perspective. And here, so just to give you again an example of quantifications. So you have principles like, for example, grandfathering. So based on current emissions, immediate per capita convergence, where you assume immediate equal per capita convergence based on the population of the countries. A variant of this is a gradual shift from current emissions to equal per capita. Then a dominant, another approach is, for example, equal cumulative per capita. So here, where you also include historical responsibility in terms of emissions, and you would cover a lot here how sensitive that is, for example, depending on the year where you start counting emissions. Then another one that you would probably know is ability to pay, so based on GDP. And there were, of course, proposed different ones, combinations like, for example, greenhouse development rights, where you also adjust the distribution based, for example, GDP, but also on so capacity, but also on historical responsibility. Exactly. And yeah, so this is basically just to give an overview of what is out there. And of course, there are many other different efforts that were already highlighted in other presentations. But what we, for example, also did within the Elevate project were also to ask a bit different experts through expert interviews. So how should certain justice considerations be integrated in global integrated assessment models? And so here we had open or semi-structured interviews with these experts and tried to really make sure that we have interdisciplinary sampling. So we interviewed, or colleagues from ours interviewed not only IAM modelers, but also people who are colleagues who are quite critical of scenario work, or people who are just working kind of on the intersection between justice and scenarios. So here is also suggested reading that was already published for more details. And here that a point that I wanted to highlight also here when we speak more about challenges of bringing justice into models. So in this work, we then identified kind of what we call 3 shapes of how justice could be brought into IAMs. And so the first shape is, I guess, kind of where we at the moment also work the most, is improve inputs and representation. So here the view is that you can directly integrate certain justice considerations in IAMs by enhancing model structures, and social group representation, right? Kind of expansion of assumptions and linking with different more advanced tools. Then the second shape is also where lots of work is happening right now, where we expand and co-design access to IAMs and also use many other tools, like, for example, national models and more detailed granular models. And then the more critical final shape is about, also, as again, and this is, I think, a critical challenge, a critical takeaway point as well that I would like also maybe to suggest that you think about, is also to rethink more how IAMs are used within the broader climate governance, and to explain this third point, the third shape, a little bit more. So here, the key issues, the key concerns that colleagues had was that there's on one hand, of course, the risk of misrepresentation. And this is why we should, I think, try to never say also that a certain pathway that where we bring in maybe some of justice considerations is equitable. That's never the case, because as again highlighted by Detlef, we always explore different options or different interpretations of justice. And then another concern is about potential for co-optation. So here the respondents raised the point that it could give an impression that societal concerns are included, but maybe we cannot do them that well in IAM, so we would need to have simplifications, and therefore it's really important within general our work and bringing in justice into models is really this transparent discussions on limitation and being very explicit about what exactly do we include and what are the implications of this, and basically never trying to be like, okay, now we have an equitable pathway kind of framing. And in terms of core issues, and then I should be finished. So yeah, I would like also to summarize a little bit an outlook, and I guess I will expand more on this and then on Wednesday. So here also work by colleague Shonali Pachauri on advancing representations of equity adjustment. We tried also to summarize kind of the key criticism and points of improvements along the scenario development chain. So here again, one of the key criticisms is about who's involved and how. And here, for example, we could try to think about really how to diversify modelers and research teams, and especially build capacity in low and middle income countries, and also think of innovative ways to engage stakeholders more systematically in the co-design also of scenarios. So here I think it's a lot about this procedural justice that is often highlighted in the narratives and assumptions. So here it's important also to involve more colleagues to answer the questions like which research questions should we ask, what futures are considered possible and desirable. And here there are many opportunities to expand scenario narratives where there is really lots of ongoing work already, include also demand side transformations, and basically consider a little bit more the socioeconomic convergence and well-being goals. So here I would also talk more about this through the already mentioned decent living standard or decent living energy concept. So I think here we also have quite some work going on. Exactly, then a lot where I guess also a lot was presented already, so about models and metrics, so how are futures quantified and evaluated. I think here quite often also from many other stakeholder workshops we always hear, and this is also something that I've already mentioned, that we need also to think about how to more effectively communicate all the assumptions, but especially the assumptions that quite strongly relate to equity questions. And finally, I think a lot can be also done, and here we can see quite often that some scenario outputs are maybe misinterpreted or politicized, and here a question is also about user interpretation, so how are results understood and used. And here I think as well for all the researchers it's important to think about quite carefully about the framing of their research. And important to kind of recognize the limitation and contextualize the output. As already mentioned by many, we need to strengthen these links between mitigation and impacts, and also adaptation assessments. And finally, as I already showed at the beginning, we might have really quite many kind of the possible trade-offs, especially if we expand the set of metrics, the indicators that we look into. And I think here we can also again communicate a bit better such trade-offs, especially in the policy relevant context. Okay, so I tried to be a bit shorter, and as that I also put everywhere the links to the readings, and I hope and yeah, please also send me an email in case you have any questions.
Just gonna say, if you unshare, you see some really nice people here. Thanks so much, Elina. It was really clear and I think really useful. And what you mentioned at the end, that would also have been my question. So if you think a paper is important, then please do it, put it in the study material folder for the students. The faculty members also have that link. That's also where I'll put the recordings and the presentations. I think that's a useful place. Yeah, so we're a bit late, but I'm sure there are one or two very relevant, important questions. You probably can't hear everybody well, so I'll repeat it if you can't hear it, but if there's anything. Yeah.
I had a comment on slide. I can give you like this or show it from a text to.
I can hear a little bit, but not everything.
Comment on slide 5. So if you could show it again.
Yeah, and it was from this overview of justice dimension from the Sin paper.
Mm-hmm.
And there was utilitarianism, and there's an example of cost effectiveness.
Maybe first wait. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I need to go now.
Did you catch that?
And something about utilitarian and cost effectiveness.
Yeah, and I would argue that cost effectiveness is not actually utilitarianism because it assigns different weights to different people. So I think only without the welfare weights would be cost effective utilitarianism, but in the way it's implemented as cost effectiveness, where everybody has the same carbon price, I think that's not actually a utilitarian principle.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Also, that we got from the reviewers as well when for this paper. So I think here we also thought more of or linked it also to other work on also with scenario work and whether we can kind of say that cost-effective approaches are utilitarian approaches. I think here the idea was also, especially if we look into the different metrics, like for example, also the SSP assumptions and how GDP is developing across different regions. So I think here quite often is assumed that that you kind of have the growth for all regions. Of course, there are also variations across the different models in these assumptions, but we thought that this is an okay simplification to say that quite often this utilitarian thinking dominates in cost-effective approaches. But you're right that this is not like a super clean categorization.
Okay, thanks so much.
Any other questions? Or it was just super clear, which was.
Dr. Nico?
Sorry?
For Nico still.
Oh, for Nico, yes, of course, definitely.
I was just wondering that too many times, like the impacts of basically everything were reflecting, of course, on developing countries, and at the same time, you said that the cost for having a non-overshoot scenario would also be borne by that countries. And I was wondering, was it only based on temperature in those countries that those assumptions, or like that it was that much higher? What kind of assumptions went into this, like calculating?
The temperature as an indicator in the damage function is usually the most dominating one. So in the paper, my colleagues Max Spots and UNIMED, they also look for other indicators like temperature variability, but also precipitation. And they found that the temperature is the indicator when it comes to the GDP response. Then you can have in the heat wave assessment, also the humidity plays a role because the heat felt by people very much depends also on the humidity. So this is also included in these analysis. And then you can also have precipitation or lack of precipitation or precipitation variability as indicators that are taken into account. And then it depends on which model and which scenario and at what location you are looking, how the changes are. But the temperature as such is really a very dominating factor of all the different climate variables you can take care of.
And maybe because we did some study as well in looking into multiple impacts and trying to integrate that into an IAM. And we also see that the effects are much stronger in global south than in global north. And one factor is indeed, and so several of these impacts are temperature related, and you're closer to that estimate of temperature if it's already hotter. The second reason in our case also is that, for instance, sensitive labor, like working outside, it's much more common in the global south and in the global north. What we did not account for, which would be another important factor, is the ability to adapt. And so it's much easier for us to build lives in countries that are much more constrained. And so, and most part there's no adaptation, that would be making that supporting some.
Just to add one more aspect. So when you take the local temperature and you look at the different models, there is also one additional very strong factor. This is called polar amplification. This means that the temperature increase towards the poles is larger than at the equator. Okay, so the global mean temperature increases, but it is not the same, and there is bias towards the pole. But still, the effect finally on the GDP and all other indicators is stronger in around the equator, in the developing countries there especially. And this despite the absolute temperature increase is small. Yeah. So this polar amplification does not undo the effect, and one of the major effects or reasons is these countries are already hot.
There's one more question here, and then I would propose to leave the rest for discussions in the break, if that's okay with everybody. And then
yeah,
possible.
show this figure. Showed that in probably the global south, inequality gets worse, but in the global north, if I understand correctly, it actually decreases. I was wondering if you had an idea of what might explain that.
So in the global north, and so the more north, the more equalizing was the effect. And the point is, countries like Germany and others at this latitude, they are below the optimal temperature. So if you lump together all the different countries, then you can see that an additional temperature increase can have a positive or a negative effect. Yeah, and this depends on the temperature in this country. So if you're in a relatively cold country, an increase in the temperature can have a positive effect. Okay? And there it then makes an equalizing effect on the socioeconomic structure of this country. Whereas if you're in a hot country, an additional warming produces a devastating effect, and this was disproportionately on the poor ones.
Great. Okay, so a few things. If you agree, I would propose to meet again at 11:50. That would, then we have a bit less than half an hour, and we will also eat a bit into the poster presentations. However, our proposal would also be to do that in a very nice, I think, but also a bit efficient way. In other years, this was a bit of a boring process sometimes, or it's difficult to keep attention if you have like 22 posters or so. So what we would propose to do then in those sessions is to let half the group, 11 people, just introduce themselves. Of course, also mention what their research is about and what their poster is about. But then keep it short, like in 2 minutes or so. And then we have all these posters hanging here. So more than enough ample time to really go through these posters and I get to know people better. But I think that's a nicer way than what was done in other years. It was also recommended from other years that was not really the approach. So that means probably that we also win a bit of time there as well. So my question to everybody would also be, please also hang your poster on the wall. So we have these two rooms, right? We have this room and we have the other one. Maybe use both of them. I think that's spread them a bit out. I don't know if that's a good idea.
Do you know who the person on the left is?
We could do it alphabetically, maybe. Or yeah, it doesn't matter much, but yeah.
So then we can also say the first 11 go here and the other 11 go here.
Yeah, that's also what I thought. And then you have sort of a mental note, like the low key. It's easier to remember these people if you sort of link them to the room. But okay, and that's one thing. And then that would be great. I have some tape there, so you can hang it on the wall. These notebooks are also here. If a few people also brought a few notebooks, because otherwise it was too heavy for me. But please also put them here if you can. Yeah, maybe I'm old-fashioned, so everybody uses his laptop, but you can just take one. There's also pens, in case you want to make handwritten notes. Yeah, okay. And then the last thing from my side, I think, yeah, is just to let you know, there's lunches this week, of course. 3 days, 3 out of 5, they're here. And that's Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And then I thought it was also nice to visit the city a bit. We'll do it anyway with restaurants and with the bike ride and anything, but also not be here the whole day in this building. So on Tuesday and Wednesday, we have something on the opposite side of this square. And I'll let you know then. But also during lunch this afternoon, feel free to take your sandwich outside or just have a stroll in that hour, of course. So that's it. And otherwise, we have very little time. So any questions? Otherwise, see you at 50 past 11. Oh, okay. Yeah. In Utrecht, there's a few poster print shops. There's a few print shops in Utrecht. So not here. No. That's also really tried to. We had a discussion, like in the end, I said, if you can do it, would be great. Sorry. Yeah, this would be too late because we can print it at PBL. We did that once, to be honest, because we had a very difficult flight, and my colleague Constance also did that. It was quite complicated actually at PBL, so now it's too late for that anyway. But then, yeah, I can only give you the print shops. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that's also what somebody else proposed, and yeah, you can choose. But I mean, the printing, even if we would hang it on the walls a bit later this week, that's also a nice option. It doesn't have to be today then. But yeah. Thank you. We'll see you. Yeah, there was apparently an email from Utrecht, some school organization. Okay, but it didn't work, and it seems like it's working. Oh, okay, sorry. They're using hospital. Okay. Yeah, okay. But they give you an extra plugin, and so that's what I thought someone said 2 weeks ago. He sent an email with
But that is working for Wi-Fi.
Oh, okay, but so that's the only thing I can think of for the Wi-Fi. And if you need, I'm also fine with.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
You don't have it because sometimes yeah,
Okay, so basically the pathway was involved. That's the. So what they shared quite the email 2 weeks ago that doesn't work. Okay, that's weird. And then, yeah, what I can do is there's coincidentally summer school organization here at the square. Maybe I could go there or somebody could go there. Because there's a church. It also says summer school on the door. And might be an easy way to check. So, maybe during lunch. It's not too late.
Maybe ask Naili to help you.
Yeah.
And to go to the summer school.
Yeah, but there's literally the office here next door. But
That's really good stuff for this.
So,
Yes. No, can we do it on there? Like it's fine.
This should always.
They have an 8 school system, but they have this.
Yeah.
And the summer school in the
Gaat de best.
Want dit zijn ook dat er zo'n woord, dus ik wil wel even vervelend lopen. Naast de keer, Jans keer zo.
Ja.
Stappers.
Zeg maar even. En je zou die camera nu moeten zien eigenlijk.
Ja, dat wil ik zo.
Maar
Ik heb gekeken.
hij is er nog niet. Je zou verwachten dat hij er gewoon bij staat.
Ja, misschien moet ik hem. Dat hij wel de user wordt.
Is this the poster? The poster?
Beide.
Deze.
De helft hier, de andere helft hier naartoe.
Oké. Ja. Dan poster jullie eigenlijk dat.
Ja.
Ja.
And why is this not the big one? I do get the one.
That's, so it's inheritance, so you have a set name, and then it has just cost name, you have effect name, you take away the cost, but the effect keeps on being in place, so it's like a lag effect, yeah. And this is what we're. You still find trace of the cost, although the cost has been taken away.
I'm not just started working with IAMs, so sometimes I'm just learning curious, but I hear them.
Okay.
And you also have a discount because I could time reading.
Yes, you can rate the.
Especially see some pages.
In the presentation, there is a page on the explaining the codes I give you, and there's a link on. Okay. The name is Iceberg.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Voor de lezer.
Very good. Ah, yeah, okay. My computer. Yeah.
That's what we didn't see that realized. We didn't
Yeah. Just
还讲一个 A4的。
Okay, in 5 minutes I can call. Sorry. Yeah, so. Yeah, I think you look at the.
有交代，有。哎呀，very decent.
Rates.
Maybe you can share.
Value depreciation. It's possible.
No.
Even if it's in place, it's how we do them. Geographically.
When you pass me, you can.
Yeah, I mean, you have different discount rates.
These are.
In different countries, very obviously.
Yeah.
So.
Or at least the lower, because anyway.
Yeah. I meant to relate, you know how we discount then less.
Yeah, then, I mean, the one thing that I should have mentioned, that I haven't mentioned is. It's because of problem is actually and the way the students choose.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I can't treat all damage that go around.
Right. I mean, it's here, there's another.
All the Trump, basically. Everybody, that's a split spread work, but you want to have a self, your interest rate.
Yeah. So, yeah.
And.
Yeah. Message. So, yeah.
Then.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, pretty interesting. I don't think, I guess it's there some.
Yes.
Even like 30 ratio. So
Yeah, what happened? Yes.
We spend this is
So we figured it out. She is right. I think